Hello everyone and welcome back. Let's continue designing the API of our authentication service. Let's see how we can use it in other parts of the application to detect if the user is logged in or not without introducing code repetition. Let's see, for example, how this observable would be useful to decide which buttons to show to the user here in the top menu. So we are going to take the authentication service and we're going to go here to the component that contains here the top menu, which in the case of this very simple application will be the application component itself. So if we see here the component, we can see that the menu is right here on the top of the template. So we are going to go to the application component and we are going to inject here the authentication service in the constructor. With the authentication service available, we are going to now implement the onInit interface, and here in the method ng-onInit we are going to pass a reference to this observable here to the application component template. Let's define here a member variable. We are going to call it user $, so this will be an observable of user. And with this member variable in place, we are going to initialize it here in ng-onInit. We're going to say that this user observable variable is identical to the variable that is available via the authentication service. Now, having this observable, we are going to go here to the template and we are going to use it to decide which buttons to show. So as you can see, initially we were showing here all the buttons, but this could potentially cause some flickering effects because depending on the timings of the initialization of the authentication service, we are not sure which buttons to show initially. So we might fall in a situation where we are showing all the 3 buttons, then one disappears. So in order to avoid that, we are going to render this section of the page only if we already have the user information available. So for that, we are going to use here a special directive called ng-container, which allows us to apply here one and only one structural directive. We are going to be applying ng-if here, and we are going to use ng-if to test for the presence of some data. We are going to use the async pipe to subscribe here to the user observable, and we are going to define also an alias to the output of this expression here. So the values emitted by the user observable will simply be called user. So here we have the user data. Now we are going to move these buttons here inside ng-container, and we are going to show or hide certain buttons depending on the presence of the user data. Now let's go back here to the authentication service. Here the service has not yet emitted any value. Actually, this variable here is undefined. So one of the things that we would like to define here is one special type of user, and we are going to call it the anonymous user, which is a value that gets emitted by this observable if we are not yet logged in. So we are going to define here the anonymous user constant, which is going to be of type user. We are going to say that the ID of the user is going to be undefined. And the email, for front-end presentation purposes, let's define here the empty string. We are going to define here this observable now. The way that we are going to define it is we want to have a way of emitting new values for this observable. So we are going to define here a subject that we are going to keep private to this class. We will call this variable simply subject. And we're going to say that this is a special type of subject that whenever we subscribe to it will always emit the last value. So it will be a behavior subject of user, and the initial value, which is a mandatory parameter, is the anonymous user. So because this type of subject always will emit the last value, we need to provide at least one initial value. And the user observable here will simply be derived from this subject. We are going to use the asObservable method to derive an observable from it. So whenever this component here subscribes to this user observable, it's going to get emitted first the anonymous user as the value of this variable, and then on subsequent values of the user observable, we will receive the actual user data. And based on this user data, we could start writing conditions such as show the logout button only if the ID is undefined. The problem with this approach would be that there might be other places on the application where we also want to know if the user is logged in or not. So we don't want to sprinkle everywhere the condition user.id equals undefined or test for the truthiness of the user ID property. So instead, what we're going to do here is we're going to go back to the authentication service and we're going to define here another observable. We are going to call it is logged in. And this observable is going to be derived from the user observable, but that is transparent for the consumer of the information. So this will be an observable of Boolean, and the way that we're going to define it is we are going to simply use the observable map operation. We're going to take the user observable and we're going to map its value. So right now we don't have the map operator in place, so let's quickly add it here at the level of the application module, right below here switch map. Let's simply import it. So with this we now have the map operator available, and we're going to use it here in the authentication service to test for the truthiness of the user variable. So we know, because we are inside the internal implementation of this service, that this will always emit a value, the anonymous user worst case, so we don't need to test here for the truthiness of user. The problem with this would be that we would be returning a numerical value. So if we want to convert a number into the result of its truthiness, we are going to apply here the double bang. So this will always return a value that corresponds to the truthiness of the expression onto which we are applying the double bang. And with this we have the isLoggedIn observable in place. Another observable that would be important to add here to the public API of this service would be the isLoggedOut observable. So again, this is going to be simply an observable of Boolean, and we are going to define this observable based on the logged in observable. And of course, we are going to be using again the map operator. So we are going to take here a Boolean is logged in, and we are going to return the negation of that Boolean. Okay, so with this in place, let's go back here to our application component, and we are going to be defining here a couple of observables. So the first is going to be called is logged in, and the other observable, which is also an observable of Boolean, will be called is logged out. So let's quickly implement them. We are going to simply take these observables here from the authentication service. So this is the end. We have here two observables available. Let's now go to the template here, and we are going to see how we are going to use these observables. So the logout button should only be shown if the user is already logged in. On the other hand, the two other buttons that we have here, they should only be shown if the user is currently logged out. So login and sign up will only be shown if the user is not yet authenticated. So let's give this a try. When the application is reloaded, we are going to see that now, because the user is not yet logged in, we can see here sign up and login, but the logout button is now hidden as expected. Let's then continue the implementation of the authentication service. We are going to do the HTTP call to the client side to create the user, and we are going to store it on the database. We will give special attention to the password. We are going to focus on password storage techniques. This is coming right up in the next few lessons.